When you come to a location for the very first time, it can be useful to have a set process that you go through in order to find your compositions. And today I'm going to be talking about the 3-step process that I follow in order to create my photographs. If you watched last week's video, you will know that my usual approach is to find a location, find a composition, and then return to that time and time again to photograph it under different conditions. But today I'm doing the complete opposite of that. I've come to a location that I've never visited before, and I'm going to walk through the 3 steps that I follow in order to find my compositions. Today I've come to an area in the Lake District called St John's in the Vale, and we're sitting on a ridge that runs north to south, and we're alongside the main A591 road that runs from Keswick in the north all the way down to Windermere in the south. We're in a kind of valley, and we've got bigger hills on the both sides. So off to my right, your left, is the Helvellyn range, and Helvellyn I think is the 3rd highest mountain here in the Lake District. Now, I have shot in this location before. I've shot at the end of this ridge on a peak called High Rig, and a week or so ago I was up here on Wren Crag photographing in the direction of Blencathra. Unfortunately, we had very low cloud that they can actually see Blencathra. But today I've come to a spot that I've never ever photographed before. This is completely new to me. And as I say, I'm now going to walk you through the process that I go through in order to find my shots. Now, the first thing that I do when I'm trying to put together a photograph is I consider what the subject of that photograph is going to be. What I want to take a picture of, what is going to be my primary subject? And the primary subject is always important in my images because that's where I want the eye to go. That's where I ultimately want the eye to finish up. Now, that can be anything. It could be a tree or a flower or some man-made object, maybe a road, maybe one of the cairns that we have here in the Lake District. But on this occasion, it's going to be a big hill. So this is going to be the subject of my photograph today. It's a hill called Great Howe, and it sits at the northern end of the Thirlmere Reservoir. And I picked it as my subject because I think it stands out in the landscape. There's a lot of contrast. It's quite dark, and the surrounding hills or the surrounding ground around it are relatively light. And so I think that that's going to help draw the eye to it eventually. So yeah, Great Howe is going to be the subject of this photograph. Once I've identified what my primary subject is, what I actually want to take a photograph of, the next thing for me to do is to figure out where I want to position myself. And the great landscape photographer Ansel Adams was once quoted as saying, "A good photograph is knowing where to stand." And so that's the thing that I then think of after I picked out my subject. Where do I want to stand? Where do I want to position myself? What's going to be my vantage point? Now, as you look around here, there's lots of different potential vantage points where I could have set up. And when I arrived here this morning in the dark, I did check out a few. But I've gone for this one. The main reason for doing that is I'm really as far over on the ridge as I possibly can to the right-hand side. And that's giving me the best uninterrupted view of Great Howe. So this is going to be where I'm going to take my shot from. And that's the second step in the process, and that's picking my vantage point. So once I've figured out what I'm going to be taking a photograph of, what is my subject, and where I'm going to position myself, what is my vantage point, the final thing to think about is the composition itself. Now, I think composition is really a case of figuring out what you want to include in the frame, but sometimes, more importantly, what you want to exclude. Now, typically, I like to use a combination of foreground and background elements in my compositions, and this helps to give an image depth. We can use perspective to create a more 3D feel. And it also allows us to create a journey throughout the image. We can start the eye in the foreground and then move it to the important element in the background. So when I'm looking for a composition, I do find it helpful to wander around with my camera And that can allow me to try and match up different foreground and background elements. Now, I'll be honest, I have struggled a little bit this morning to find some good foreground, something that's nice and strong. A lot of the shapes, a lot of the lines are leading away from the subject, and to be honest with you, I'm a little bit bored of rocks, if I'm honest. I'm sure you are as well. Now, the problem here is if I decide to exclude the foreground completely, that means getting very tight to Great Howe. And that means that the farm that sits at the foot of Great Howe becomes far too dominant in the frame. I think it's a big distraction. I don't like it at all. Now, the only way that I can combat that, I can't take it out of the frame completely. So what I have to do is try to make it as small as I possibly can. And that means shooting a little bit wider, and that means I do have to include some foreground. Now, because I don't have a particularly strong foreground for this shot, I've set the tripod up relatively high, a nice comfortable operating height. I'm really just going to use the grasses and these reeds or wild chives, I think they are, to frame the bottom of the image. The eye, I think, is pretty much going to go immediately to Great Howe in this case, but you know, that's okay. And they are there to create a little bit of depth, even if it's not a particularly strong foreground. Now, what I do like about this composition is it's got quite good diagonal lines that lead in from the corners of the frame, and that helps to pull the eye away from the edges and push the eye towards the centre where I want it to go to look at Great Howe. So that's quite good. What's not so good is that once again, we haven't been particularly lucky with the light. We've got a lot of cloud sitting on top of Helvellyn, and that is blocking the sun, which is rising from the east. So unfortunately, this does look a little bit flat, but there should be enough natural contrast to create a shot that makes it worthwhile making the effort to climb up here in the first place. So with that first shot in the bag, that is not job done. I'm now going to experiment with different focal lengths and different angles, and I'll take a few shots in portrait orientation as well, just to make the most of my effort to come here and explore this new scene. So that is the three-step process that I go through every time I come to a new location. The first thing that I do is I pick out my subject. Then, having done that, I look for a vantage point, and then finally I compose the image by looking for a combination of foreground and background elements. Now that's my approach, but what about you? If you've got anything to add, then you can do so by leaving a comment below.